Good evening, comrades and friends, and welcome to the Friday evening session of Marxism Festival 2023. And welcome to the culture tent. Sorry that the weather's gone a little bit cooler than we would have hoped, but I'm sure the warm and lovely atmosphere will keep us all happy this evening. My name's Brian Richardson. I am, I suppose the phrase is, a long-standing member of the Socialist Workers' Party. I'm also, for my sins, a criminal barrister, which partly explains why I'm dressed the way that I am. I would, of course, have dressed for the occasion because it's Gary Young, but it is partly because of that. It's lovely to see so many of you here. It's lovely to see some faces that I've known for many years. It's lovely to see many new people here, and I hope you're all enjoying Marxism Festival, whether it's the first time you've been or whether you've been many times before. Tonight's session is a book launch, and it therefore gives me a huge amount of pleasure to introduce the person whose book we are going to be launching tonight, Gary Young. Gary is an award-winning writer and broadcaster. In fact, Gary, I think that congratulations are in order, are they not? Because this... Yep. Better at writing than handing a mic, perhaps. No, but congratulations, because I think this very week you have been awarded the Orwell Prize for Journalism. That's and that is, it's an award that is, if I can quote the Orwell Foundation, it's an award for writing that best meets the spirit of George Orwell's own ambition to make political writing into an art. I think it is a richly deserved award because Gary is an absolutely brilliant writer. He's best known to many of us for his work as a journalist. For many years was both a columnist and I believe America, Washington and Chicago correspondent for the Guardian newspaper, as well as writing for a number of other publications, but also broadcast as well. And tonight we are specifically going to be launching Gary's new book, which is called Dispatches from the Diaspora. Gary, before we come on specifically to talk about the book, I want to ask you a couple of preliminary questions, if you like, because I think you and I, there's a similarity both in our ages and our backgrounds, in that we were both...
Are you 35?
35 again. Both brought up in, I think, you call it the home counties?
I was brought up in Stevenage, yeah.
And I was brought up in Windsor and Maidenhead.
Okay.
That's a bit of a confession.
Yeah. It's not quite the same.
Both brought up to parents who came over to this country from the Caribbean, part of the Windrush generation, and therefore, of course, part of that generation who had to endure those signs saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, and had to fight for their recognition in this society. I suppose a preliminary question is, for you, growing up in those circumstances, what was that like?
Well, it was the 70s. I'm 54, so growing up in the 70s, so the economy was in the tank, racism was on the rise, and there was this sense that you couldn't be British. I think there would have been different opportunities for solidarity if I'd grown up in London or Birmingham, where there would have been more black people, but there were relatively few black people, and so you kind of you had to make it up as you went along. And I was very lucky. My dad left when I was 1. That was not so lucky. But my mum was she was a local activist and a campaigner in a way that she wouldn't have ever described herself as that, but she ran youth clubs and she taught literacy in the evenings, and she was a nurse and she became a teacher, and she had politics, and she was determined that we would have politics, you know. So so I guess the answer to what that was like, it was pretty hard, and as I think is often the case, it was made easier with a knowledge that the way that it was hard wasn't about me personally, it was about broader things that were going on that related to me, that did relate to me, but they weren't about me. So I don't think I ever got to the stage of thinking, well, they're just being mean to me. It was more like, that is an awful sentiment. You are part of an awful ideology almost, but never like, why are you just picking on me? Sorry. Yeah.
And one of the formative experiences, and you talk a little bit, I think, about it in the book, which we'll come on to in a minute, is actually going on, I think for many of us, the anti-apartheid movement was a formative political experience in the 70s and 80s, and that was something that you, with your mum, involved yourself in, wasn't it?
Yeah, so I think there were three really formative experiences. One was that when I was 15, I joined the Workers' Revolutionary Party. So when I was 16, I left the Workers' Revolutionary Party. But that was a very intense year in which I learned a lot about what not to do. But it was a kind of a means to, for example, I went a lot of pickets during the miners' strike. And which was the other very formative thing in my kind of another very formative thing, the second thing. And so it was a means to kind of engage in some things, and ultimately, because their thing was like the revolution is just around the corner, and the only reason it hasn't happened yet is because we're not trying hard enough. And that felt, as someone who had never really been involved at 15, like during the miners' strike, that felt kind of plausible, and then it didn't feel plausible, you know. And then there was anti-apartheid, which I picketed the embassy with my mum every Friday night, and then she would go off to a Saturday morning school afterwards. She taught at a Saturday morning school down in Peckham, and I'd go home. And I felt very kind of keenly about the anti-apartheid struggle and this kind of madness. I also, if I'm honest, felt there was a little bit of ambivalence in that there were a lot of people in that movement that I thought were more comfortable exporting their anti-racism than dealing with it here. But I saw it as a way of connecting those two things. I was very it was something I was really into, and it was pretty much the first thing I did when I went to university in Scotland was set up an anti-apartheid society.
And Gary, I want to come on to this because you go to university, Heriot Watt, up in Scotland, finish. I'm not quite sure how the circumstances in which you then were involved with The Guardian, but the very first assignment, and it's one that you talk about at the beginning of Dispatches from the Diaspora, extraordinarily is covering Nelson Mandela's election campaign in the early 1990s. How was that for you?
Yeah, well, it was crazy. And first of all, the way in which I get into The Guardian is quite instructive and quite important, I think, because in the mid-80s, uprisings in London and elsewhere create an awareness in the Guardian group that they're writing about black people. They don't have any black people writing for them, or certainly not enough. And so they set up a bursary to encourage more black people to go into journalism. It's not attached to a job, but it is to do a course. And I think that that's important because it is one of the many ways in which my ability to ascend is connected to broader struggles. I get my column in 1999, which is the same year that Yasmin Adebayo-Brown gets her column, same year that Steve McQueen wins the Turner Prize, year before White Teeth comes out. those things aren't necessarily causal, all of them. Mine was, actually. But they are contextual, and they relate to what's going on, you know, elsewhere. So there is that. And yes, The Guardian has a fairly regular liberal dilemma. They are sufficiently aware to understand that there are stories that white people can't do in South Africa, but have not been sufficiently aware to employ black people that they want to cover them. So then they look around the office, they don't know what the stories are, they're looking for somebody young, cheap and black. And you know, well, I was 24. And they said, you know, go out and see what you can do. And it was amazing. It was an amazing experience. And you have to imagine, first of all, I've been reading this stuff and, you know, campaigning and so on. And then to be in a stadium where people have only seen Mandela's face on a poster, and it's in the middle of nowhere, because that's where they would put townships, you know, so that there was minimal risk of insurrection. And you're standing in the stadium, and then they see the cavalcade in the distance, because there's nothing around, just kicking up dust. And everybody starts, they start ululating, they start screaming, women with no teeth, children with no shoes, just dancing. And they keep going, and the dust is getting bigger, and the cavalcade's getting closer, and the excitement, that just, it, you know, Labour had just been taken over by Blair. You know, that's where the politics were here. So to be in a place where people were truly excited, and then there's a moment where Mandela would get out of the car and get into a white truck, so he could climb on the truck, and then he would do a few laps of honour and wave his fist. And you just feel like I couldn't be anywhere else, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And and you know, that was amazing. And then the other thing that was funny, really, was I couldn't drive. Like, I didn't have a driving license, didn't know how to drive. So I would have to catch lifts with people, and then they'd take me somewhere, and then someone else would take me back. Anyway, I went to one of his rallies, and then someone took me half the way back, dropped me at a gas station, and said, there's people come in, and they know you're here, they're going to pick you up. And it was Mandela's bodyguards. And I amused them. You know, I made it my business to amuse them, frankly. And they had studied in the Soviet Union, and I studied Russian, so I'd studied in the Soviet Union. I'd been an activist. Some of them had studied here in Britain. They didn't think I was going to do anything crazy, so they just let me ride around with them. And they would kind of call me and say, oh, we're going to Pietermaritzburg, you know, do you want to come with us? And so I kind of, by this time I was 25, I had my 25th birthday there. I'd stumbled into Mandela's entourage, and, you know, quite often then I would be in that cavalcade, like, you know, 3 cars down. I'm sure Mandela often thinking, who the fuck is that guy there? You'd have to imagine it's 2008 and you stumble into Obama's entourage.
But Gary, just on the Mandela thing, because, you know, looking back, it really is quite extraordinary to think about how significant a moment that was. Mm. You know, internationally, I was a student in Manchester in the 1980s, and our student union building, the university where you're now a professor actually, was named the Steve Biko building. I think it is still the Steve Biko building. The student union down the road, Manchester Polytechnic as was, Manchester Metropolitan University as is, was named the Winnie Mandela building. And all around Britain and elsewhere, buildings were named in honour of Mandela, Steve Biko, freedom fighters in South Africa, because it was such a huge struggle to, and therefore for Mandela release was a huge victory. And so then the election campaign must have been just something absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary. It was weird too, because there was never any doubt about who was going to win. It wasn't a regular election campaign in that sense, and it was, you know, there were elements that were quite morbid. So one of the reasons that many of us followed Mandela was because our new desk feared that he would be assassinated. There was all the stuff going on in KwaZulu-Natal. At one stage, there were dead people on the streets of Johannesburg in the middle of the campaign, in a fight between Inkatha and the ANC outside Shell House. So it was quite volatile, but there was this kind of overriding sense of kind of confidence. I remember the morning of the vote itself, the first morning of the vote, and I stayed in Soweto, and then I went with the family that I was staying with to vote, and there was this kind of heavy mist that hadn't quite that was kind of burning off, so you could see, all you could see was people's shoes, and it was completely quiet. All you could see were their shoes, and then as the mist burned off on the walk to the polling station, you could see they were in their Sunday best. And that moment wasn't a moment of euphoria. It was like, we got business to do. It was like that, and they would just kind of, you know, and they kind of got in line and they joked, and they boiled the water the night before because there was a fear that the Afrikaners would poison the water supply. So it was this kind of, it was fragile. And it was quite funny seeing particularly broadcast journalists who were trying to get them to be excited and not understanding, it's like, in certain moments this is what excitement looks like, or this is what it is, you know, and they would say, like, are you excited? You know, and people would go, yes. And they would say, why are you excited? It's a very important day. Very important. Why is it very important? Why is it very? Of course, it's important. It's our first day. It's the first democratic elections. Okay. Can you say I'm excited? It's important, and why? I actually saw a guy say, I'm excited. It's important, and why? And it was, you know, this effort to. Which often happens, I think, not to see it for what it was, but to see it for what you want it to be. And it's like, look, this is a very proud moment, but they're prepared for it, and this is the business end of it. And so they're not going to be doing the conga line while they're waiting to vote. That's not how it's going to go down.
Gary, I'm going to take some questions from the audience in a minute, but just a couple of other questions first. The book itself, I was struck by one of the phrases that you used when you talked about how, having been taken on as a journalist, you were advised by some people, you know, not to get pigeonholed as a black writer, but then by others, you know, can you write a bit more from a black perspective? And I love the phrase you used about, I think it was quoting Chris O'Philly about pigeons.
Pigeons can fly, yeah.
Let me tell that story.
Well, it was cruder than that in a way. There seemed to be two things I could do, an older journalist, trying to be helpful, I think, and they would either say, just don't write about race. Just don't write about race, because you will be pigeonholed. Always in a passive voice. Someone else will pigeonhole you, not them. Or you can only write about race. So the first article that I wrote, first column that I wrote, was spiked because it was about Bosnia, and he said we've got people who can do that, unless you can add an ethnic sensibility to it. And I said, do you not think Bosnia's got enough ethnic sensibilities without me adding mine? That's not going to be helpful. So so there was. And what I found it peculiar, because I thought, well, are you saying don't write about race because it's so well covered? because so many people are doing it, because it's not an issue which is important, because it seems to be, you seem to write about it a lot, or are you saying I can only do it because that is the limits of your imagination? And what very few people ever said to me was, write about what you're interested in, write about what you're passionate about, because that you'll do best. And I always say to younger black journalists, that if you're into sport, write about sport. If you're into fashion, do that. If you're, if you're into music, do that. Because you know what, you're still going to be black. You're still going to bring your perspective to that. And you can write about more than one thing.
And in fact, Gary, of all of the, hundreds of articles and columns you've written, not all of them have been about race by any means, have they?
No, I think 2/3 of them weren't. I mean, I wrote a lot about the Iraq War. I wrote a lot about gay rights, about the left, about Corbyn, about Europe. I wrote, about all sorts of things. So I would count episodically, because every now and then somebody's like, why do you always, and I would say, well, I don't, but then I would check and I'd be like, oh wow, actually I do that a lot less than I thought I did, and that's because race is one of the things that I'm interested in, but it's not the only thing I'm interested in, and in any case I'm not interested in it as an abstraction. I'm interested in it because of its point of intervention towards greater freedoms for kind of everybody, really. So, and then there's the weird stuff about, well, when I write about Obama, is that a race story, or am I just writing about the president? If I write about France right now, am I writing about social unrest, or am I writing about black people? Because white people, or there are black subjects, but there are never any white subjects. Do you know what I mean? White subjects are just general subjects, in the same way that there is racism, but there's never any racists. Nobody would admit to being a racist, but very few people would deny that there is such a thing as racism. And so it was this kind of weird category that I was told to be in flight from, and I think, why would I want to be in flight from blackness? I mean, it doesn't define me, but it is one way to describe me. That would mean being in flight from Du Bois, from the blues, from soul music, from the South African struggle. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in there that you might actually want to get involved in, whether you're black or not.
And as it happens, this book is specifically about race and race issues, if I can put it that way. Why did you choose to put together the book in that way?
Yeah, so it's my second book was a collection of journalism from America, and so this one was a decision that I made maybe about 6 months after Black Lives Matter had kicked off. George Floyd had been murdered. And there was one basic reason, and then one reason that has emerged as time's gone on. And the basic reason was, I thought maybe there is some value in having all this stuff in one place. Most of it is on the internet, but not all of it. But maybe there is some value in putting this together as a continuum, not least because there was this way in which it's written about in journalism where each time it's like for the first time, like mainstream journalists discover race like teenagers discover sex, it's kind of, it's earnest and it's voracious and it's careless and they think nobody else has done it before. And so why wouldn't, so there was that. But then there was another thing that emerged. The more I thought about it, and this is basically, I realised how old I was, and that if you were 25, Stephen Lawrence, if you are 25, Stephen Lawrence was always dead. Nelson Mandela, when you were born, was about to be the former leader of an African country. The McPherson report happened when you were 1. Hurricane Katrina happened when you were 7. I mean, you can do the math for the rest of it, but that there was some value in trying to suggest a continuum that, you know, this stuff right now, it didn't come from nowhere, and it has been part of a process. There is something organic in it, and there is kind of value in locating it in its historical space through journalism. There are other ways to do it, but, you know, I was blessed to be in New Orleans for Katrina, to be on Mandela's campaign trail, to be on Obama's campaign trail, to kind of bear witness to all of these things. And then there's another bit in the book which is interviews, and you know, I've been blessed to interview Desmond Tutu and Angela Davis and Maya Angelou and Stormzy, and so there is some value in putting that in one place.
Well, and be thinking of your questions, because I'm going to come to you in a minute, everyone. But just a couple of final questions for me before I do, Gary. And just picking up on that last point you were making, really, the book's divided into 5 sections. The 5 sections have got titles which are familiar to those who study black literature, black culture, and so on. So titles such as Change is Going to Come, Things Fall Apart, Ways of Seeing, Express Yourself, and Me, Myself, and I. But when I was reading the book, I was struck by the fact that they weren't just chosen on a whim. They actually reflect something specific that you were trying to achieve in those sections. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so each section, there were moments of hope. It was change is going to come. There were moments of, and that involved, you know, Obama's victory, you know, the night that Obama wins, the Mandela campaign, things like that. Then there were moments of despondency, or of, sometimes not despondency, but maybe deflation. So 5 years after, I go back to South Africa and look at actually what has changed. And it's, you know, it's not like it's all terrible, but it's not great. Or an assessment of Obama's legacy. There's also the interview I did with the mother of a boy who stabbed another boy. So, yeah, tougher moments. Ways of Seeing, which is the only one that's not black, that's from John Berger book, is moments where I try and just shift the lens. So I write an essay in defense of Uncle Tom, the character, who, if you read the book, is actually quite a brave man, actually, who dies because he won't tell the master where the slaves have run to, even though he knows. And he's not a revolutionary, but he's not the political figure that he is caricatured as. Or I did a thing, imagine Boris Johnson was a black woman, you know, which was a kind of thought experiment about like, so don't literally do that, because if you haven't eaten, you'll never eat again, and if you have eaten, but yeah, what he gets away with, what a black woman could not get away with. Just take, you know, Diane Abbott's like ridiculous statement, and then the pylon, as opposed to all of the things that Boris Johnson has done. Imagine if Diane Abbott couldn't tell you how many kids she had. Do you know what I mean? For example. Anyway, so just shifting the lens. Then Express Yourself was the interviews, which, a little brief interjection, because it is one of my favourite stories from here, is the 45-minute interview that I was supposed to have with Maya Angelou that ends about 13 hours later with me rolling out of her limo drunk. And her only a bit less drunk. And then the last, Me, Myself and I, which is personal essays and reflections and those moments where things that have happened to me or some of my experiences I feel could be usefully engaged journalistically. So when Barbados got its 50th celebrate its 50th year of independence. My mum died when she was 44 and was buried in Barbados, and I talk about like Barbados reached 50 but she didn't, and all of that, or thinking about when I was leaving America and what I'd learned in my 12 years there, and so on.
Last one for me, so I hope you've got questions. And I suppose, Gary, this one picks up on a couple of those themes that you mentioned. A change is going to come, but also things fall apart. One of the things that really strikes me about your writing and the essays in this book is your critical examination of leadership and leaders. And so looking at, and you know, the fact that first experience was Mandela, who was always going to be the next president. Your time in America was coterminous with Obama, who obviously wasn't always going to be the next president. But also, I know about your admiration for Martin Luther King in particular, and the I Have a Dream speech, and one of the shorter books that you've written which is specifically about the speech. But one of the things that struck me was, regardless of whatever admiration you may have for all of those, you're not afraid to critically analyse them, and I thought that was something really interesting. Do you want to say something about that?
I guess it's not just that I wasn't a fan, I thought that was my job. Do you know what I mean? And that people used to say of kind of Obama, it was a bit different with Mandela, well, I give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think, well, he's president, he's got enough benefits. He's president, we should be critiquing him. And that at a certain point, they go from being agents of change to agents of power. And then you have to examine them. You have to examine them in context. But I kind of think that that's my job, and it was my job, and it was one of the things that's interesting. So the piece about Mandela is a piece that gets from my job, basically. And in that piece, and I was young, so I didn't exactly know what I was doing, apart from that I thought this was my job. I described how when he arrives, after all the excitement when he arrives, actually he's quite a boring speaker, Mandela. And the excitement kind of goes out of the stadium. And back then, and even more recently, people were like, God, that was kind of, well, what were you thinking? And I thought, well, first of all, it's true. And it's not like anybody who was there, if you said, God, that's a bit boring, isn't it? Would say, like, no, I'm scintillated. It's not. It was true. But also, I said, look, he was in jail for 27 years. He came out, he managed to unite a country, steer it towards non-racial democracy, and, have this vote. He doesn't have to be a brilliant speaker. That will do. And that kind of, I prefer him to be a human being than a metaphor. So I wasn't trying to show off. I was just describing what I saw. And just as I described that excitement that I described earlier, I also kind of saw this, and I thought, well, if I'm trying to tell people what it's like to be here, I should say that too. But I think it's incumbent on you as a journalist to, it's not just about telling the truth, but trying to understand what's happening, and particularly to kind of critique those with power. And in those moments where people that I like have power, the fact that I like them is secondary to the fact that they have power, frankly. And sometimes, maybe it makes me even harder on them, because I want them to do better.
And of course, it highlights the fact that we can't simply rely on, to coin a phrase, getting black faces into high places.
Yeah, and that kind of being besieged, as we often feel on the left or as black people. I understand that limits our space to be self-critical, because everybody is criticising us all the time. But it makes it all the more important to find the space to be self-critical, because that's how we progress. So you have to be responsible about it, I think, but you have to do it.
Let's take some questions. I'm sure there must be people burning to... I see a hand there. You take a couple? Yeah.
Yeah, see, it's not that easy, is it?
So you need to press it so that the green light's on.
Yeah, great. Yeah, just want to say thanks, Gary. I heard you speak a couple of weeks ago in Liverpool at the Stand Up to Racism fringe meeting organised by Camden Unison. It was absolutely brilliant. And you talked then a bit about how you have to have both the vision, the dream, and the organisation. And you talked about Martin Luther King's speech, but the guy who organised was a trade union organiser who helped build the march for on Washington and the rest of it. And I think, could you say a bit more about that? Because I think that's so important. Because one of the things which Marxism is really good about, it's good for us, give us the inspiration, but when we finish and go home, we have to do the organising, I think, and that's really important. I'll just say, you know, if you're going to do that seriously, I think we have to be in an organisation. So I'm going to just tentatively suggest that if people aren't involved in an organisation, they should consider joining the Socialist Workers' Party. So, informed here later on. But yeah, but thanks for your speech today and 2 weeks ago in Liverpool.
I don't see any other hands yet. Oh yeah, there's one there. In fact, I can see a couple. Press the green light.
Sorry everyone, yeah. Congratulations Gary on the Orwell Prize. You mentioned you like early Trotskyist sort of past in your youth. Orwell's been described as a kind of literary Trotskyist of sorts, you know, his anti-Stalinist kind of thing. I just wondered what you thought of Orwell himself as a journalist, you know, was he inspirational or what you thought of him?
Okay, so the answer to the first question, yeah, the March on Washington, where King makes his most famous speech, most people don't know that it was a march for jobs and freedom. It was for jobs and freedom, and it was co-organised by the trade union movement, and it was the brainchild of A. Philip Randolph, who was a union organiser, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and the chief kind of on the ground organiser was a guy called Bayard Rustin, a gay African-American man who worked with A. Philip Randolph and did the nuts and bolts of kind of how many toilets do we need, how many, like advising people not to bring egg mayonnaise sandwiches. It is kind of late August, they're going to go off, you're going to get sick, we're going to have to clean it up, like, you know, bring something else. All that kind of stuff which someone had to think about. And that it was a feat of, because they didn't want to, with the exception of A. Philip Randolph, none of the civil rights leaders that year wanted to have a march. And what happened was the grassroots after Birmingham became such that they couldn't not have a march. They had to do something. And so that left them with very little time. And it took a brilliant person like Bayard Rustin to kind of make that even possible. And he was only able to do it through existing institutions, trade unions, black churches, civil rights organizations, and so on. On the flip side, you do have the inspiration, and you do just have to imagine if Martin Luther King had got up there and said, we need a 10-point plan. Not, you know, I have a dream, I have a 10-point plan. Which, maybe a 10-point plan would have been like, you know, he's dreaming of people being able to get together and black children and white children playing together. 2 weeks later, they murdered 4 children in the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. This was not a great time to be dreaming of reconciliation and of the, you know, the possibilities. Apart from that, it's always a good time to do that. And that there is something crucial, I think, about utopian thinking. Now, you can't be dreaming all the time. At a certain point, you've got to wake up and actually do something. But that of dreaming of the world that you want and then working out how to get it, rather than just working on, well, I can get this, so we'll just go for this, and that will be, you know, I would like to live in a world without borders. That's my desire. I don't, you know, and when people say, without borders, like, what? And I'm like, do you really want to dream about border guards and barbed wire fencing and dogs and bloody passports? Then you have your dream, but that's not my dream. And I start with that. I know that's not going to happen tomorrow. I know that in the meantime we've got to fight for asylum seekers. We've got to stop all the stuff going, you know, the deportations to Rwanda. We have to stop all of that. But that is my framework for understanding these kind of these moments. And it's when those two things come together, the organisation and the vision, that you know, things can become really electric. With regards to Orwell, I think that kind of, you know, I haven't studied him, and I do understand that there are a range of ways in which he was quite problematic, and I do have read some of the things he said about kind of India and being against Indian independence at a certain time, and why he thought it was irresponsible and sort of all of that. And so, but what I like about his writing and his work, his journalism in particular, is the way that quite often he'll say, well, hang on a bit. Do you know what I mean? Hang on, let's take a step back here. There's there's an essay that he wrote, and I won't say the title because people get upset, but he wrote this essay, and it was in response to a book saying the democracies, England, France and America, should fight the autocracies, the Soviet Union and the Nazis. And he says, yeah, are we democracies actually? I mean, if you look at the colonies, we're not. And you've just found a way not to see that, not to understand that. And I'm grateful of anyone in the 40s and 30s in Britain who has an understanding of Britain's colonial structure and how fundamental it is to Britain's place in the world. And the other thing about Orwell, he's eminently quotable. Do you know what I mean? That there are a range of, he had great range, and he had seen, you know, the Spanish Civil War and so on. He'd actually put his body in the way of his ideas, and that gave him real currency. So, you know, I am grateful for his work in the broadest sense. Judith?
Thanks. Is that me? No. Thanks, Gary. It's great to have you here tonight. I just wanted to, following on from what you were just saying there about the atmosphere here, you know, in terms of how migrants are treated, what's happening with Suella Braverman and her whole policies. When you mentioned Black Lives Matter and the explosion of, you know, resistance, it was just incredible. And ostensibly, it was in solidarity with what was going on in America. But when the streets were filled in central London, in Hackney and other places over those weeks, it was also about racism here. And I think that when you mentioned earlier about plenty of people are, you know, willing to acknowledge there is racism, but actually nobody wants, like the Metropolitan Police, for example, don't want to acknowledge that they are institutionally racist. But I suppose I just maybe wanted you to talk a bit more about that, because I know some people have said to you, oh, you lived in America, it's so much worse there in America. You know, it's not like that here. We don't have that same sort of racism. Well, of course, everything's different. But, you know, we've had people of the Windrush generation that are being so lauded this week as being the fantastic contribution they've made to British society, and there's all these. But we've been deporting, our government's been deporting these people. They've been sending them back. Some of them never had a journalist to talk to until recently. Nobody took any notice of it. They were just sent back. And it's heartbreaking, isn't it, what's happened to so many of that generation. And yet, you know, we should be celebrating what they brought to Britain, and the whole society. So maybe a little bit about that people can end up belittling the sort of racism that really does genuinely exist in Britain today, and how this government is fueling it in such a horrendous way. I just, to maybe explore that bit would be great. Thanks.
Ooh.
I think that
Yeah.
it kind of follows on from what Judith was saying a little bit. I wanted to just hear your view of how you think, what direction America's going in now, sort of post-Obama, Trump, and the anti-abortion, the increase in kind of hard right-wing ideas and ideology. And I know you kind of left America partly because of your fears for that kind of growing intolerance that was happening. So I'd just really be interested in hearing what your take on the direction America's going in.
Just take one more.
Yeah.
It's on. Apologies. It's a two-part question. Because you're from the home counties, I'm also from the home counties. I suppose, at what point were you comfortable within your skin? And also, any advice to young people who are racialised as black, navigating and operating in predominantly white structures? I suppose building on from your advice to young black journalists, which is to write about what you're interested in.
Okay, so I understand why you would, just at the end where you said, I came back. I came back for really banal personal reasons. I didn't actually come back because of the way that America was going. And, there was a weird thing. So I came back in 2015. So Black Lives Matter was kind of, big then. And people would say, is it the racism? Is that why you've come back? And I would say, yes, I've come back to Hackney to avoid racism. And then 2016 came around and Brexit happened and people said, oh God, I bet you're really sad you're back now. And then in November 2016, Trump was elected and they said, well, God, I bet you're really glad that you left. And in my mind, among other things, they are two big, racially problematic countries. So, and it happens to be where my life has ended up. I've got an African-American wife. I was born in Britain. So, that's what I have to deal with. But I experience, and this is kind of taking both of your questions, or elements of your questions in one. Increasingly, I think of racism as a language with different dialects, and that there is an American inflection, there's a British inflection. If you went to Holland, it would be different again. They're all recognisable, but they're all somewhat different. And so, everything in America is more lethal because they have guns. So its racism is more lethal. And America does also have a huge black middle class and several black-led institutions that you can kind of lean on, and a racial consciousness that I think is in many ways the American left is more sophisticated in its racial consciousness if they're on the left than the British left are. I think that George Bush, not of the left obviously, has to go to when New Orleans Katrina happens, he has to go to New Orleans and say we have a terrible history of segregation and racism in this country. You can't avoid it. To avoid it, you'd have to be Trump. You'd have to be that crazy. Whereas we have Gordon Brown going to Africa and saying we have nothing to be ashamed of when it comes to the colonies, and empire. And Britain has this amazing way of not even misremembering, but kind of casually pretending to forget where it's been and what it's done. So people say, we won the war, even if they weren't born, even if they didn't fight. They said we won the World Cup, even if they didn't play. But you say, well, who colonised our country and raped all those people? It wasn't us. I wasn't there. It wasn't me. And so that notion of a collective identity is incredibly selective. And that makes conversations about race here much more difficult and complicated. And I worry in this, I feel like the Black Lives Matter raised consciousness, raised confidence. It kind of pollinated in a range of ways all around people, different institutions and so on. But what it never had was an organisation, really. And so it cleared a lot of space, and I feel that this is true of quite a lot of the stuff that we do on the left. At the moment, we are able to clear political space, but not build on it, right? And so we have this weird moment where if you look at most of the polling, it suggests that people have a sharper racial understanding than they did before the demonstrations. And yet, we are going backwards in terms of Rwanda and politics. So we have a sharper racial understanding of the more racism that we are experiencing, which is a contradiction and a challenge. I think that, broadly speaking, America usually looks like a basket case from here, and that's often because it is, but it kind of would anyway, I think. Most of the anxiety that produced someone like Trump, he was an expression of that anxiety. He didn't create it. And you could see it with Palin, and you could actually see it kind of come through in the Iraq War. And some of that is about white people are going to be a minority within the next 10 or 15 years. And so this country that has only been a non-racial democracy for 60 years is struggling with that. And it's struggling with that in the most violent and repulsive ways. It also, though, has a real, there is a real fight back taking place there. And one of the problems is that things like the courts, which are politically appointed, have been stacked, and it will take years to kind of get rid of what Trump was able to achieve in 4 years. And the Democrats clearly don't have a response, and we know this because they're putting up an 80-something-year-old man for the presidency, and there are real concerns about what, you know, they've had 4 years. It's not like we didn't know it was going to be this age when it stood. They've had 4 years to find someone else, and they can't find anyone else that would be acceptable to them. And that's a problem. That is a real problem. There is a real chance that Trump could win even from jail. Your question is a good one. And the honest answer to the first bit of it, when did I realise I'm not sure I'm even comfortable in my skin now, you know. It's a process. And that's not just because, you know, I think it takes a lot. I think it's a lifetime's work to be comfortable in your skin, regardless of, you know, what colour that skin is. And that's a joyful process, actually, I think, or it can be, of, you know, working out what works for you and what doesn't work for you, and so on. And that my general piece of advice would be, as one travels through the mostly white institutions, so long as you're in Britain, most of the institutions will be mostly white, that's the fact of it, is that you, first of all, find your allies, because you are in a majority white institution. But some of those white people will support you, and you can't tell by looking, and some of the bad people won't, and you're not going to be able to tell by looking at them. So you're going to have to, you're actually going to have to find them. And the second thing would be to be strategic. You know, the number of times as a sort of senior person at The Guardian, when a younger person would meet some really frustrating obstacle, and I would say to them, leave. If you have to leave, leave. But just understand that you can't resign from white supremacy. That wherever you go, racism will follow you. That's not a reason to stay here, but it's a reason to kind of understand the broad. You have to have a bigger game plan than just that person who's being a dick and a racist, and this institute. It's like, what do you want? What do you want to achieve, and how you're gonna, and some kind of sense of how you're gonna do it. But also to understand, and this is the point about my bursary and about my column, is that you're not going to get there on your own. And your fortunes, it doesn't matter whether you think you're good or not, it's kind of almost irrelevant. Because there have always been black people who were good at stuff, but they didn't get the chance. There is an intimate and clear connection between you getting on and being comfortable in your skin and what is going on elsewhere. The degree to which black people are fighting and resisting. That's when I feel most comfortable, when people are out on the streets and when people are speaking their mind and when people are expressing themselves as free people. That's when I feel most comfortable. That's when I feel good. And that however much you want to do personally and that you should do personally, it's not personal. So you're going to have to do it with other people.
Gary, I couldn't help noticing whilst you were speaking about America and about struggle and fight back, that we have with us, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but we have Chris Smalls, who is the president of the Amazon Labour Union in the United States. Spoke brilliantly at the Marxism opening rally yesterday evening. Chris, I don't know whether, having heard what Gary's had to say in the discussion, if there's a contribution that you'd like to make?
Yeah, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Chris, but here's the spot right here.
I didn't know the mic was there either.
Yeah, how you doing, everybody? Thank you for sharing this space with me. Yeah, it's definitely spot on. I mean, coming from America, being a black man in America, probably the hardest thing you could do. And I was just talking about this earlier with my assistant, Melissa, who's here with me. You know, next week, July 4th, is my birthday. And to be 35 years old and alive is an accomplishment by itself, and it's sad that we had to talk about it that way. Is that the fact that I made it to 35 as a black man in America. And I'll say this all the time when I talk about policing and police brutality. Last year when the Amazon put me in jail, you know, it was shocking to a lot of people to see that video. They actually probably won the election for us. But if people think that was my first rodeo with the police, they sadly mistaken, you know. And to understand, growing up as a black man in America, I've been in handcuffs more times than I can count. You know, I've been in the back of a police car for nothing. You know, I've been racially profiled for driving home. I've been arrested outside of my home, having to give up my identity just to prove that I lived there, in the same neighborhood where my children go to school. So racism and the history of it, racism being taught in America, racism not being addressed the way you put it, when it's time for us to come together as people, we have a time where it's a wave and it hits that peak moment like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And then we have the distractions of life. The economy, the system. The government always puts us back to work. That's exactly what happened during this pandemic. We forgot why we were in the streets. Now we're all distracted with our daily lives and our daily movements. The movements are now divided. I remember being in the streets and I saw Black Lives Matter on the line with Extinction Rebellion. And all of that has dissipated over the years. Now, we're so divided in America. If I make a phone call to call another organization, it's a slight chance that they won't even come. It's more than that. They probably won't even show up. So it's like me as a labor leader, understanding that labor is the basis of our democracy. No matter what movement that you're in, whether it's social injustice, environmental, Black Lives Matter, whatever it is, women's rights, trans rights, whatever you're doing, at the end of the day, you're a worker. The working class struggle is everybody's fight. So when we talk about the labor movement, we're talking about everybody. Everybody has to understand that this fight against Amazon is everybody's fight. 10 years ago, we all wasn't shopping at Amazon. I can tell you that right now. So is it really Amazon adapted to society or society adapting to Amazon? Same thing. With our movement in our country, and the hardest thing that I'm doing, being out here, building international solidarity, it's going to take all of us to defeat Amazon and to beat these systems that's been in place for decades. So the time is now, really, and this, we could talk and discuss all of it, but this has always got to be a call of action. What are we going to do when we leave here? And once again, I'm one person, and 3 years ago, this was not me. If you asked me this 3 years ago, would I be standing here talking to you, I looked at you like you were crazy. We're making unionizing cool again, appealing, and that's great. We're reaching the younger generation. The education is the most important part. We all got to be an army to teach everybody what we have to fight for, and I'm just trying to play my part. So I could go on and on. There's more to come tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. We've still got time for a few more questions, but and I will take you. Gary, just before I come to that question, just thinking about what Chris said, but also I think Judith's contribution reminded me of a couple of things. It reminded me of one of the shorter, angrier pieces in this collection, the piece that you wrote after the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer. A really kind of passionate piece of journalism. But it also reminded me of one of your previous books, brilliant books, Another Day in the Death of America. And I suppose it raises with me the idea of what really good journalism is about. Because some people say you should just present the facts. That, being partisan is not what you should be about. But I think, and Judith, when talking about people who are part of the Windrush generation not having anyone to speak to, actually one of the other best books I've read in the last few years was Amelia Gentleman's book, The Windrush Betrayal, where she says at the start of that she thought or tried to be objective, but realised when she talked to people and heard their stories that she couldn't be like that. And certainly reading that essay, but also reading Another Day in the Death of America, what you were trying to do with that book suggests that that's the kind of approach that you took during your career.
Yeah, I mean, I think that objectivity, if you're a minoritized person or a less powerful person, then you know that you're coming from a place, right? But the more powerful your identity, the less likely you are to understand it as an identity at all. So nobody's ever asked me, when did you come out as a straight guy? Straight people don't get asked that question. Nobody's ever asked me, how did you be a foreign correspondent when you had small children? Because men don't get asked that. So, so growing up black and working class, it was never a luxury of mine to think, well, I'm above all this, which doesn't mean you have to be fair. I think impartiality is overrated, actually, but you have to be fair. You have to give people a fair shot. But there's something else that relates to what Chris said and to Judith's point, which is when I was training to be a journalist, they go through all these things these adages of what journalism is, like journalism is the stuff that goes in between the adverts, you know, or whatever. These kind of ways of sort of making you think about what journalism is. And one of them is, and this is the adage, so it's sexist, but it's when a dog bites a man, that's not a story. When a man bites a dog, that's a story. And you get it, right? Like, we expect dogs to bite people, we don't expect people to bite dogs. But sometimes, as a journalist, you have to ask, well, who owns these dogs? And why do the same people keep getting bitten? Because if we look at things like Black Lives Matter, it's not a case that more people were being shot dead by the police. What happened was, people started taking notice that what Amelia Gentleman uncovered with the Windrush betrayal was something that was going on for a while, but that people didn't notice. So they weren't news as such. They weren't new, and they certainly weren't news to the communities that they were handling to. They just became news to the people who make news. Do you know what I mean? They suddenly discovered it. And so an awful lot of the stuff, Me Too would be a very similar thing, where women have been kind of living with the kind of constant experience of sexual harassment, and then it kind of becomes news. And you've got to ask yourself, well, what were the news people doing before? Do you know what I mean? What did you think was news before? And the truth is that they had become inured to the idea. Well, you know, when I did Another Day in the Death of America, which, for those who haven't read it, it's about all of the kids that get shot dead in one day, on a random day. And I'd spend 2 years finding their family and their parents and so on. That you'd ask the journalist who usually had written it up, like, did you call the family? And they'd say, it just wasn't so rare that a kid would get shot down there. It wasn't news, you know, and so then you figure there are places where kids are supposed to get shot, and there are places where they're not. And if they do get shot in those places, then it doesn't interrupt your understanding of that place. One other thing that speaks to the kind of how hard this is to live with, and this is a story from the States, was I used to walk my son to his daycare in Chicago. He would have been 3 or 4. And at a certain point he said, can we go this way? And I said, this way's quicker. And he said, I don't want to go this way. And I said, yeah, but this way's quicker. And he said, no, but the police keep stopping black boys this way. He wasn't more than 4, and I think he was 3. And I had noticed that too, but I didn't know that he had noticed that. And I said, oh, you know, we'll be all right. And he said, why? And, you know, you can't explain structural racism to a 3-year-old, as I find out, because I get caught out. So I said to him, well, we haven't done anything, we'll be fine. And he said, but what have they done? And I said, you know what, son, let's just walk the other way. You're right, let's just walk the other way. But that was about me being defeated by racism as much as anything else. And, you know, it was a very, it was quite a painful conversation, actually. Because it's, you know, of course, I mean, kids see lots of things, but I didn't know that he had both, he'd not just seen it, he'd taken it in, he had understood it, and then he had kind of given it me back as a kind of, as an anxiety.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for that, Gary. I just want to make a couple of observations. It seems to me that when Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was doing something that the ruling class in America really feared. And it wasn't just fighting against segregation and against racism. Martin Luther King was assassinated because his project of fighting against racism developed into another one, which was fighting against social justice and organising sanitation workers in very much the same way that our comrade Chris Smalls is organising the Amazon workers. And if Chris has Jeff Bezos as his enemy, all power to you, Chris, there, because Martin Luther King when he started to organise workers and support those workers' struggles, he was taken out by the American state. And my question to you is really about your viewpoint on a particular author and journalist in America. I don't know if you know of him. He's called Charles M. Blow. He's quite prominent on the scene in terms of on the talk shows. And what was shocking about him as a very middle-class black person in America was that his attitude to the whole Black Lives Uprising and rebellion was a very pessimistic one. I mean, he wrote a book. His book was called A Black Power Manifesto. And I was keen to read it. I thought, my God, okay, the traditions in America are the Black Panthers of the 60s, revolutionary. What is Charles M. Blow going to say in his Black Power Manifesto? Basically, it was telling black people, look, go back to the South, go to Georgia, build an electoral base, and those states separate off in America, black states and white states. Absolutely awful. I mean, you know, back in the day when it was Marcus Garvey, yes, in a way, back to Africa, it was uplifting and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, to break America in two, so that one part is black and the other is white, is what the far right in America would want to see. And I think it's tragic that there is the middle class influencing things. Obama stopping the basketball and athletes striking in support of BLM. And it was inspiring to see the working class actually taking action all along the West Coast. It was the dockers up and down who took strike action in support of the BLM movement. And I think it's sad when we have that explosion in the 60s that black power obviously means so many different things, very abstract. And for Nixon and the Republicans, it was black capitalism. But I'll finish there. I just wanted what your view is on the black middle class in America today when it comes to black people fighting back.
Yeah, Gary, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you look at what's happening in Britain today, when you look at Swallow Batherman and you look at Rwanda and you look at actually what's happening on the streets, we're talking about deaths in you know, by the police. Actually, we've got to think about Chris Cabba. We've got to think about Russell Charles. We live in Hackney, Russell Charles and stuff. There is a lot to be really angry about, and there's a lot to be really sort of, you know, depressed about as well. But I think what's interesting, when the Black Lives Matter movement erupted and when George Floyd happened as well, I think it's quite interesting to listen to different generational perspectives of racism and stuff. I work in local government. I work for the Youth Offenders Service, and we've got a lot of, you know, we were encouraged as a group of black workers to come together and actually talk about our experiences of racism, and we had a couple of forums and stuff. And in the first forum, I'm a bit older than you, I'm 57, all right? And in the first forum, people of my age, we all talked about our experiences of being chased by the National Front, of being attacked in pubs, of being stopped and searched, of the SOAS laws and things like that, and how horrible and how overt racism was when we were growing up. And you talk about people coming to the streets. Actually, I remember when I was growing up in Hoxton in Hackney, when the National Front came on the streets, I remember as a little black kid being really scared and being really intimidated. But actually when anti-racists came out on the streets, when the anti-Nazi League came out on the streets, when organised trade unionists came out on the streets, actually it gave me a sense of hope. And that's something I talked about when we spoke about our experiences of racism. So that was important, but what happened the following week? The following week when we had our meeting, all the younger people in their 20s came on, the black people in their 20s came on and said, well, you guys spoke this last week and we listened to you, but that's not our experience of racism. And I find that actually when you talk to young black people and you tell them the stories from the 70s and the 80s, they sort of have a sense of incredulity and they don't believe what's happened. And the question I've got to ask you is actually, we have seen generational change, and I think we can all talk about how horrible the situation is. But I think the fact that actually young people can't imagine the world that we grew up in is a positive thing. And I also think as well that when we look at the fight, I think there's a lot to say that we can get depressed about. But I think we also have to remember the great struggles that we went through in the 70s and 80s and the resistance that came from that. And I just wondered what your perspective is on that, Gary.
Answering that one, can I just raise, and it's obviously a very, very, very topical issue. One of the, I think, one of the best contributions in dispatches from the diaspora is the one that is entitled "Riots Are a Class Act," a very provocative title, which obviously was a reflection on the riots in France in 2005. Is that right? Clearly, in response to what we've seen in the last couple of days, the assassination of a 17-year-old youth of Algerian Moroccan extraction by the police, we have seen uprisings again in Paris. And I thought what you had to say then was very, very interesting about, you know, the kids having, you know, a ball but needing a party. I wonder whether you'd like to kind of pick up on that theme, partly in response to the questions that were asked this afternoon, easily.
Right, so taking the first question first, I haven't read the Charles Blood book. I'm aware of his journalism, but I don't think this is new. I think that the period that you evoke of the 60s and so on, there were also middle-class black people then saying you're going too fast. Martin Luther King wasn't universally popular among African Americans because they thought he was rocking the boat, and they didn't know where it was. It's not entirely irrational, right? They didn't know where this was going to end up, and sure enough, he was assassinated. You know, Malcolm X was assassinated. Medgar Evers was assassinated. They took a lot of people out, the civil rights workers in '64. I would say one other thing that King did, which really, I think, actually troubled the establishment even more, was talk about Vietnam. And when he connected the injustice in Vietnam to the injustice in America, that's when the money went, that's when Lyndon Johnson cut him off, that's when people were like, you got to stay in your lane. And that King himself was part of a journey in that he went from being one of those middle-class black people and, you know, wanting things to be more proper and sort of behavioural politics and all of that, not segregation, I mean, Charles Blow's argument is really Louis Farrakhan's argument, really, and it's, you know, first of all, it's not going to happen, and secondly, why would you want it to happen? But I don't think it's new. I don't think it's new. That I think that within the black community, within every black community, there's a stratification of class, and there will be elements of the middle and upper class who want stability, you know, and you see it. I think whenever, like, a professor gets stopped in his car and he says, I'm a professor. And it's like, I can't believe you're treating me like black people. Do you know what I mean? How dare you? Can you not see I'm a professor? Well, you can't earn your way out of racism. You can't behave your way out of racism. It's, you know, it does what it says on the packet. You can mitigate some of the effects, but nobody's looking for, you know, Mike Brown's payslip before they shoot him. Don't know how well off George Floyd is when they kill him. There's an assumption, but like, nobody looks at me and think, you know, professor. So, you know, these assumptions are often wrong. I think that I think that's something that is lacking, and I felt this for a while in Britain, is intergenerational exchange. With, not just within the black community, actually, also among the left, actually. a kind of, and this is another one of those things where you realise how old you are. That if I start talking about the 70s, it's like 50 years ago. That's like if I'm in the 80s and someone starts talking about the 30s. You're like, what are you talking about? Do you know what I mean? Like, things have moved on. And of course, some things have moved on, some things haven't, and that there is benefit in experience, and and most of this comes from an honest place, I think, but can be overcome by a generosity of spirit, which means older people shutting up sometimes, and then younger people speak, and not saying, no, you got that wrong. And younger people understanding that there is something that they can learn from people's past experiences, and that generosity isn't always there, but it is possible. Now, I've been doing it's a funny thing when a book comes out, because there's a sort of festival circuit, and so I have a book out. Linton Kwesi Johnson has a book out called More Time. Well, partly maybe good partnering, partly a limited amount of imagination. Like Colin Grant also has a book out. So me and Colin Grant have done 3 events so far. Me and Linton have done 3 events so far, because they think, well, who can I put Linton with? You know, and I think Linton and Colin have done an event so far. So it's like, we're just trading. But I did an event with Linton last night. I did one with him at Lambeth Town Hall. And I did think that there was some value in this event as a sort of transgenerational exchange, as a kind of, and this is already an old man talking to an older man. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that one of my projects, because there's an interview with Stormzy here, and I've interviewed Stormzy again since, and we're not friends, I would not say that, but I like him. And we've hung out a bit while we've been doing these articles. And I would really love to see an event with Stormzy and Linton. That would be great. These are 2 lyricists, and Linton's heard of Stormzy. Stormzy hadn't heard of Linton. I managed to get Linton to sign the book for Stormzy and give it to Stormzy. So this has been my little project, like a sort of Cupid, to get them together, because there is a conversation to be had, and it's about how things are different and how things are similar, and it's also the young man there saying, well, how did you deal with this? And it may not be the way that he will deal with it. You know, I remember being in The Guardian and saying to someone, you know, I've been here 24 years and I'd like to think you might be here 24 years, but then and seeing in their eyes and thinking, you fucking loser, you've been here 24 years. Like, what is wrong with you? You know, because the idea of a stable job was a thing when I joined, but now it's like, no, you got to keep moving. So I think that exchange is really necessary and vital, and it's one of the things, as I said, that I thought when I'd done the book, I thought, well, this may provide an introduction to that conversation, if you like, because it comes up today, it comes to now, but it starts when I was 24 or 25, and it tries to create some kind of link between them. But I do think it's necessary. Otherwise, we end up reinventing the wheel every time, and there's really no need. I also think that Steve McQueen's Small Axe was really useful and important in things like that. So I think art and culture play a really big role.
I absolutely endorse that. And on that score, actually, let me just give a plug for, I don't know if people were here earlier, for the session that Soweto Kint, who is a brilliant award-winning saxophonist, MC and broadcaster, and talked about the album that he produced during lockdown, White Juju, and how it entrenches racism. He's going to be performing after this session at Mully's Bar, which is just 5 minutes from here. So after you've got your copy of Gary's book, I'm sure Gary will happily sign them. After you've got your copy of Gary's book, head down to Mully's Bar, where the entertainment will be from Soweto Kitchen. It'll be well worthwhile going along to that. We're going to finish now with Gary reading an extract which gives a flavour of the book. So Gary, the final words. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for your contributions and questions. Gary, the final word's yours.
Thank you, and thank you, Brian. Well, brilliant piece of chairing. This is from the, yes, let's hear it for Brian. Yay. Big up the barrister. This was the last column that I wrote for The Guardian. So it's in January 2020, it's just after the election, just a month. When I was a child, my mum used to put on the song Young, Gifted and Black by Bob and Marcia, put my feet on hers and then dance us both around the living room. They're playing our song, I should say. It was the early 70s, she was barely 30, and I was the youngest of 3 children she was raising alone. Struggling to believe there was a viable future for her children in a country where racism was on the rise and the economy was in the tank, we danced around the living room, singing ourselves up, imagining a world in which we would thrive, for which we had no evidence, though we did have great expectations. Much of the politics that has informed my writing in this column came from my mum. It's partly rooted in her experience. She came to Britain just a month after the Commonwealth Immigrants Act was passed. She came because the then Health Minister, Enoch Powell, had embarked on a colossal programme of NHS restructuring that required more nurses. She was living proof of the immigrants that the British economy needs, but that its political culture is too toxic to embrace. For her, sex, race and class were not abstract identities, but forces that converge to keep her wages low and her life stressful. But my politics is also rooted in what she made of those experiences. She was an anti-colonialist and an anti-racist, an internationalist and a humanist who would never have used any of those words to describe herself. Race conscious as she was, most of her community activism, youth clubs, literacy classes, discos in the church hall, took place in the working class white community. They, she'd say, were her people too. When I was 10, she made me stay up and watch the Holocaust mini-series, which freaked me out. And when I was 14, she took me to watch Gandhi, which was way too long. Both times she told me, this is your story too. She believed the world that she wanted to create was never going to come to her, so she would have to take the fight to it. I saw her confront the local National Front candidate, the police and her union, to name but a few. She took me on my first rally, Help the Aged, when I was 4, my first demonstration, CND, when I was 14, and the first picket, South African Embassy, at 17. Even in her sudden and untimely death, there were valuable lessons, that life is too short to waste on people you don't care about, but long enough to make a difference if you want to. She was 44, I was 19. She never got to read my columns. My presence on the Guardian pages would have been, I think, as unlikely to her as anything she hoped I might achieve as a child as we padded around our living room. I sign off from this column at a dispiriting time, with racism, cynicism and intolerance on the rise, wages stagnant, and faith that progressive change is possible declining, even as resistance grows. Things look bleak. The propensity to despair is strong, but should not be indulged. Sing yourself up. Imagine a world in which you might thrive, for which there may be no evidence, and then fight for it.